This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price you can get Truefire All Access for.
Okay, in this video, I wanted to kind of talk about some of the things that I have heard people say about vintage guitars, and maybe on both sides, kind of things that we shouldn't just take for granted as actually being true, because I think there's a little bit of bias on a few different levels which have actually ended up meaning that I've kind of thought that these things were overhyped, overpriced, and that, you know, anything modern would obviously kill a vintage guitar. On the other hand, you know, that there might be the absolute holy grail. I think we need to be careful. Just, I guess it's not that difficult to necessarily figure out why someone might be saying certain things, but equally, you know, try and keep those things in mind. And if you ever get a chance to play a vintage guitar, jump at it and, you know, try some in some shops, see what you think. You know, they are expensive, they are somewhat rare, but I think they are also somewhat different. very first group of folks that I think are saying stuff about vintage guitars, which I think, to me, has not borne out to be at all true. It comes from some of the folks that are, I guess, trying to sell you more modern guitars. And, you know, they will tell you that guitars are made better now than they were made then. Now, I think maybe that might be true on average, like if you think about the cheapest guitars being made today versus the cheapest guitars being made in the 60s. But I don't think it's necessarily true of things like Fender and Gibson guitars. And there are reasons for that if you like look into the stories. Like, I'm not an expert, but you look into it a little bit. Essentially, at the time when these guitars were being made, it was a much smaller industry. These were expensive guitars relatively then too. And if you, basically, I think it was something like in the Norlin era when that started. There were more guitars being made in like the first year of the Norlin era than any of all of the combined years of Les Pauls made before. So it was something like, I don't know, I can try and find the actual numbers for that. But essentially, modern day guitar production, particularly if you're looking at something like a Gibson or a Fender, is going to be actually not very close to what was happening back in the day. Some of them are still using the same machines and all of that sort of stuff, but I think it is definitely the case that, you know, things that were made like this without CNC machines and with different materials, there is a difference. And, you know, for instance, you know, these days you've seen even like someone like Nacho who's kind of saying, I can't get hold of the same wood, or I've got a limited supply of like old growth southern ash. Certainly that's not something that companies like Fender and Gibson are necessarily able to get hold of in huge quantities either. I think there was also, you know, a blight on southern ash in the US as well. So things are different. And I think that is really the main thing. And I also would not, this is one of the things they say, that these were made wrong. And that, to me, is almost kind of the most ludicrous thing of all. If you play a few of these types of things, if you just play a few. And I don't know that this is for sure the case, and I think maybe if you went boutique, you would find that this was different, like these numbers shift around a bit. But in terms of actual man hours spent on a guitar, I get the sense that something like a Gibson Les Paul or a Gibson SG or these guitars, there was more time that a human spent on these guitars. It wouldn't have meant that they were perfect out of the factory. And the other really good point that Paul Reed Smith made about these vintage guitars is that in many cases you're not seeing the original kind of fretwork and stuff. So for example, with this guitar, the head of master luthiers at Taylor from Chile, is it Lito Benito? I think that might have been his name, and did the refret job on this. So in some cases, especially if it's a modern, you know, not a modern, but as in a vintage guitar that's been looked after recently, these are very, very expensive guitars, and it would make sense that you would take it to a very, very good luthier. And in that sense, you end up, you know, maybe comparing a guitar that is fantastically set up by a really experienced kind of repairman versus some guitars that might have come straight off of the factory floor. So there is something to that as well. Now, that's the other thing I would say, is that in terms of how perfect and the golden era and some of those bits and pieces, I do think that if you're someone who's not into sort of a rounder fretboard, maybe in some cases like a narrower neck. So this is from an era of Gibson guitars where they started using a sort of narrower nut. So it's got a slim neck, but it's also narrower this way, which is one of the things that Tom Bukovac kind of pointed out. Like, if you go back to 1964, I think it's when the specs had slightly wider nuts that are going to suit some people differently. So it's also definitely one of those things where you can imagine that there are going to be players that might put their hands on these and go, actually, that's nothing like what I want in a guitar. So if you're someone who's like, I don't know, like Rob Chapman, who's playing guitars with a flatter radius or guitars that are modern with higher output pickups, then I can see that it's not going to be to your preference. In particular, what I found with quite a lot of these guitars, like the Norlin, this as well, I think, the 53 Gold Top that I played of Ed Alesco's, the radius on these fretboards is actually lower than 12 inches. It's closer to 10 inches. And certainly on the Fenders around this sort of time as well, vintage Fenders, you'd be going sometimes as far down as 7.25. Now, players like, I believe, Andy Wood, his signature 16-inch compound radius, or 16-inch radius maybe the whole way. There's quite a lot of more modern players that have got into this idea of modern playability and, you know, flatter necks. And for you guys, I think it might absolutely be the case that you kind of pick up one of these guitars and go, what on earth is that all about? And I could totally see in that case why you feel like, if it's because it's so like personal how a guitar plays and all that sort of stuff, where you'd be thinking, well, for me that doesn't make much sense playability wise. But there are definitely people who love that sort of playability. Like for me personally, I love a vintage radius. My favourite sort of production Fender Strat is the Vintera 60s, which has 7.25 inch radius. My K-lines have a 10 inch radius. The Nacho has a 9.5. Custom shop Fender has a 9.5. So I think, you know, that's one thing. You can get modern guitars with these more vintage kind of sensibilities as well. But the other thing that I've found is that they actually look a lot less blocky than modern guitars to some extent. I guess because time and, you know, hands working like sandpaper over time, you get slightly rounder edges and, you know, aging and all that sort of stuff. But I would say it also seems like the overall sort of template is a little bit sleeker. Whereas like a modern SG, to me, they seem a little bit blocky. Sometimes a Les Paul as well seems a little bit blocky. When I actually played that 53 Gold Top in the hands, it was not a feeling like that. It was a different sort of thing where it's like, actually, this is really nice feeling. I also played like a 50s ES175 that belongs to Project Music. And again, that was a feeling like it was an old guitar, and, you know, typically like an ES175 you think of as quite a bulky instrument. But in your hands, they actually feel not like that. There is something definitely sleeker about the feel of these, I would say. I don't know if any of you guys would agree in the comments, but that is, I think you can't necessarily believe either side. Like, maybe, as I say, if someone's telling you that the absolute holy grail of guitars are these like vintage examples, and you're someone who likes to play with a flatter radius, then you're maybe going to be completely disappointed and, you know, these relatively noisy electronics. If you're a Fishman Fluent Strandberg player, like there are lots of different folks out there. So for you, you know, the idea that you'd spend any money on a guitar like this, well, frankly, it probably plays like firewood to you. I would say, yeah, that makes sense. So you can't necessarily imagine that this would work for them at all. On the flip side, if this is what you want, then it's really, and these kind of guitars are what you play, there really isn't too much like it being made anymore. I'd say that middle ground for me, where you kind of get the best of both worlds to some extent, seems to be more in the boutique world. Like if you think of something like a Fibonacci, some guitars like this, or Seth Backus, you know, guitars that are still not totally made CNC, guitars that have plenty of handiwork that go into them, not necessarily just parts caster type stuff, but that go a little bit beyond that. I think a way you can get some of that, a little bit of magic, you know, something like the Nacho to some extent, I think is about as close as you can get convincing wise that it is an old instrument, even though obviously you're going to know that it's not, and we know it's not as we're playing it, but actually goes some way to capturing the vibe, as well as something closer towards the sound, like it's a little bit, you know, warmer, a bit darker than many of the modern type Fender things that I've played. Yeah, but at the end of the day, if vintage is really what you want, then you can't really beat an actual vintage guitar. Although the Nachos seem quite close in that JD Simo has, you know, played a lot of different guitars, and he seems absolutely hell-bent that his Nacho might be one of the best guitars he's ever played, which is interesting to me. Anyway, don't believe anyone on vintage guitars. You need to try and play one before you make your mind up.